Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Real Estate Live session on blended cities, hosted by the UK Innovation Corridor. I'm Ross Sterling. I'm representing Real Estate Live. Just here to welcome you to that. Real Estate Live is a week of free online events focused on keeping the economic development, regeneration, and inward investment conversation going through this tricky time. There are many events in the week, and you've joined this by going through the website, so you know how to see the other ones. Just to kick off today, we're going to do a poll. Those of you who've been to other events will know that we have done this on every event. You'll see it come up now. And what is the most important factor in unlocking development and ensuring the continued strength of UK real estate? Pick your option now. What we'll do is we'll put all that together with all the answers from the other sessions, and we will make something interesting at the end. A quick bit of housekeeping for this session. You will, I'm sure, want to ask questions of this august panel. If you do, please put them into the Q&A, the button down the bottom, and that will mean that the chair can see them and can ask a question, pass them on to the chair. Right. Before we hand over to the chair, though, the next person you will hear from is Anne Lynn, who is the chair of the UK Innovation Corridor, who's just going to do a quick welcome on behalf of them. Anne, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ross. Thanks for organising this second event in the series of 3 that we're participating in as the UK Innovation Corridor. And thank you, all the participants. We had about 30 plus yesterday, and we've got about 30 people on today. And I think that's largely due to the topics that we're discussing and the range of people that we can bring together with the fantastic panel we have. I'm very, very grateful to all the panel that you can see before you for giving us your time. I'm just coming up to the end of my first 3 years as the independent business chair of the Innovation Corridor. And I think it's fair to say, because he's on this call, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Greg Clark, who along with John McGill and others got this going, and we wouldn't be here, and I think making the kind of great strides and progress that we are making, and I hope, as we'll see today, keeping up with the innovation of the way in which placemaking is evolving. If we hadn't had the kind of legacy that Greg and others left, and we didn't have the kind of participation from some of the people on the call that are with us today, like our councillors, council leaders, the private sector, and in effect, the unique combination of communities that comprise the Innovation Corridor. So thank you for supporting us. We're going from strength to strength, and we intend to make, as far as I'm concerned, the next 3 years, the Innovation Corridor will be a place where we can grow, and we can grow innovatively. Innovation is our name, and innovation-led growth is what all our local authorities along the corridor want to be engaged in. So you have a great panel of people who can speak about aspects of that today. I'll hand over to Helen for you to take it forward. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. So welcome everyone to this discussion on blended cities. I think it's going to be a really interesting one, and there's certainly plenty to talk about. So I'm joined by Professor Greg Clark, who is a global advisor on future cities, Tom Holbrook from Fifth Studio, and Monica Jane from TfL. To briefly introduce the discussion, this year has obviously been one of much upheaval, and that's changed our outlook on life, on work, leisure, and on how we move between those parts of our lives. We're going to be asking whether the changes in the housing, labour and transport markets offer a new set of opportunities for the towns in the UK Innovation Corridor. Can there be a new mix of functions and activity in places like Harlow, Stevenage, the Upper Lee Valley and towns close to Cambridge, as increased digitisation, particularly in the advanced technology sector, blurs housing markets now that people don't have to travel to work every day? Could there be a hybrid model in which we can find a new paradigm for our towns and cities? So plenty to discuss. First of all, I'm going to hand over to Greg, who's going to give us his take on how urban areas might change due to the pandemic. So over to Greg.
Great. Well, Emma, thank you very much indeed. I should just mention, or Helen, excuse me, I should just mention that my ability to share slides seems to have just been turned off. So it would be good if we could turn that back on again. Something's not quite right here. Okay. So is it possible to, right, it looks like I'm going to get there now. Excuse me. Great. Can you see my slides?
Yep, that all looks good.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and warm greetings to everyone up and down the UK Innovation Corridor. I'm speaking to you from very sunny North London this morning, and working from home as many people are. What I want to do very quickly is set the scene for the conversation, really by asking the question, what kind of agent of change is COVID-19? We know that it's a human health crisis. We know that it's a trigger for an economic shock and a recession. We know that it's a challenge for public finances. There are all sorts of aspects of this pandemic that are interesting and unusual. But is it an agent of change? And in particular, is it an agent of change for places? Now, in order to try and answer that question, I want to set the scene very quickly and say, I think the context for this is that we're now into the 5th decade of the century of the city. So from 1980 to 2080, the world's urban population growing from roughly 40% of 6.5 billion to roughly 80% of 9.5 billion. We know that cities are good for us. We know there's a risk of bad urbanization as well as a promise of good urbanization. And part of this process of change is that urbanization, and particularly urban density, has become associated with contagion. But any of us who've read any of the history know that there's a long history of cities innovating in the context of public health crises and making significant reforms and changes as a consequence. And some of those changes have affected the shape and the size of cities and how they're laid out. So there's a historic relationship between pandemics and the way cities and regions and metropolitan areas are organized. And we'll come back to that shortly. We also know that in this century of the city, the relationship between cities and climate change is a dual relationship. On the one hand, cities produce carbon emissions and heat island effects magnify these. And on the other hand, cities are vulnerable to climate change, as you can see here, sea level rises being particularly an acute challenge for cities. More of that later, perhaps. We also know that in this 5th decade of the century of the city, the 4th industrial revolution and a new generation of technologies is affecting not just the economies of cities, but the way we organize and manage cities and metropolitan areas and regions. And that's reflected in this slide, bottom left-hand corner, if you like, the smart city systems agenda, bottom right-hand corner, the 4th industrial revolution, the new sources of jobs, enterprise, trade and investment, and the corridor which we're talking about today being a critical junction box for both of these things. The smart applications on the one hand, increasing the quality, efficiency, responsiveness of urban governance, city and regional systems, transportation, placemaking, social infrastructure. And on the other hand, this corridor being a series of connected hubs of various dimensions of the innovation economy, the sharing, the experience, and the circular economies. So this corridor is a kind of stage within the UK where many of these processes are playing themselves out. Now, if we think about COVID-19 and we ask the question, what kind of agent of change is it, apart from the human health crisis and the economic shock? Maybe we can make sort of 6 core observations and then ask a couple of questions. I'm going to do this extremely quickly, and I hope people will forgive me. But clearly, one way in which it's an agent of change is to do with trade routes, corridors, supply chains, logistics, and everything that goes with it. If you like, it reveals the need to shift from a focus on optimum efficiency towards a focus on optimum resilience. The movement from just in time to just in case ways of thinking. and of course the application of new technologies to how we do that, but an agenda around sovereign capability, onshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, and the opportunity that creates to diversify city and regional economies. The second way in which it's an agent of change is the massive uptick in digital technology and the servicization of the economy, the shift to an as-a-service dimension, whether it's the office as a service or retail as a service, or whether it's healthcare as a service, remote learning, telemedicine, distance digestion of all sorts of content, online retail, online entertainment, a massive two-cycle shift in the way the economy works, with many implications for all sorts of sectors and businesses. The third vector of change, as it were, from COVID-19 is to do with health. It's to do with the adequacy of health services, health screening, labs, testing, track and trace, hospital capability, everything else we're used to talking about. But it's also to do with the revealed inequalities that COVID-19 has around healthcare, lifestyle, life expectancy, and everything else. And this connects very strongly to the fourth vector of change, which is to do with the planet, carbon, climate change, and action in that area, particularly the underlying of the connection between human health and planetary health. If you breathe poor air quality and you suffer, therefore, more from a pandemic that attacks the lungs, then it's very clear that climate change is making you sick. So coming out of COVID-19, a new agenda, whether it's called Build Back Better, or it's called the Green Recovery, or it's called tackling climate change as part of the recovery, it's really clear that this is part of the nature of change we're living in. The fifth area is to do with politics. It's to do with geopolitics on the one hand, perhaps a retreat from some of the multilateralism, a more managed kind of globalization, but it's also to do with the relationship between citizens and governments, which has been profoundly changed over the last 6 months as governments have needed to become much more activist in the lives of people, and a completely new agenda has emerged around civil liberties, around personal privacy, around the speed in which legislation to control citizen behavior has been enacted, and of course a broad spectrum of opinion about how valid, how credible, and how useful all of that is. But nonetheless, the re-establishment of the role of government as the key manager of the public health agenda in countries has been a key part of this. The sixth issue has been what we might call the new social contract, the recreation of neighborliness, as it were, the rise of social capital, increases in philanthropic activity and mutual aid activity. But at the same time, I think, real challenges for the corporate world around how to address corporate responsibility, the emergence of the ESG agenda, and I think increasingly some desire for greater fairness in the way that tax systems operate. So if you like, a new social contract perhaps giving rise to a new license to operate for business, for investors, with, in the context of the rise in digitization, new agendas around tax fairness and many other things. Now, if you take these 6 vectors of change, as I'm calling them, then obviously there's a jobs dimension to all of this, not just the question about the recession we're going to have, but which places, which sectors will be most impacted in a first phase and a second phase. If jobs have become more virtual, which temporarily provides the advantages of flexible working, how long before those jobs are actually taken to another place or completely automated? Jobs that require face-to-face and face-to-place activity severely disrupted, and every evening in our news we read about this. But also some very big questions about cities and about place, the future of real estate, the new forms of mobility, the new choices that people are able to make about where they live, how they work, when they travel, and in particular, the impact on different kinds of places, depending upon the industrial or sector composition that they have, which sectors have more jobs, which are more digitizable and which ones don't, and what this means for the future and the fortune of places becomes very interesting. Now, I think this translates into a very interesting conversation about the future of our cities. And on the one hand, there's a debate that says we're going to give up the physical city because it's no longer safe. Much of this is seen, of course, in the American media at the moment. And we're going to embrace the virtual city, which is in a sense placeless. And you'll see this debate happening around the world. My own intuition is that what we move to here is something that's more like a kind of blended city, where we live more hybrid lives based on a greater level of agility, where when it's safe to do so, and probably in a post-vaccine environment, we see a repatriation, as it were, of the physical city in all its forms and all of the amenities and services and privileged environments that it provides. But we combine that with the advantages of the virtual city, the efficiencies, the flexibilities, and the choice that that offers. Now, one way of thinking about this is to say that this is a kind of acceleration of a series of changes that have been in train for some time around the shape and size of urbanization. If you like, from my top left-hand corner image here of the densifying city as the key way of accommodating growth, through a whole series of scenarios down to the bottom right-hand corner where you see things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the shape and form that urbanization has been taking over the last 4 decades, as we entered this 5th decade of the century of the city, is one that has been varying. And if you look at box number 8 here, you see the emergence of corridors of multiple cities and towns and other locations as a kind of form of the 5th decade of the metropolitan century that was emerging in any case. So my point is that I think COVID-19 accelerates the interrelationships between different places by providing, through digitization, much more overlapping geographies between housing markets and labor markets, supported by new forms of mobility, as well as existing forms of mobility. To put this at its most simple, if it's possible for people to choose where they live, how they work, and when they travel, it's much easier for them to live in one place and have a job that's based in another. It's much easier for them to live these hybrid lives and to think about, for example, living in London but working in Cambridge or vice versa. And although some people have been doing this for some time, the shift towards weekly rather than daily commuting patterns provides a new opportunity to do that. So I see this as really affecting 6 aspects of our lives, how we make decisions, the built environment and how that works, how we use mobility systems, what kinds of critical infrastructure we need, how we use public space and well-being. And you can see it leads to an agenda, I think, of quite substantial reforms in these areas. Now, if you think about the UK Innovation Corridor, which we're here to talk about today, I think what this means is that we have the potential to see an even greater overlap of the different kinds of labor market, housing market, supply chain, and collaboration geographies that the corridor has already been a facilitator of. So for some time, UKIC has been talking about this corridor as a series of interdependent locations. And my proposition today is that COVID-19 accelerates this function and makes it possible for higher levels of interconnectivity and interdependence to occur in this corridor in the future. And this gives rise, I think, to a very significant discussion about how to make places and how to connect places in the future. So those are my opening remarks, Helen, and I hope that sets the scene for the discussion to come.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Greg. That was extremely interesting. I think a very Yeah, very interesting vision for the future there. So I'm now going to pass on to the other panel members to give their response. First of all, starting with Tom Holbrook, who I think wants to talk a little bit about what all this might mean for the corridor's new towns and for the Upper Lee Valley. So, Tom.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks, Greg. That's really intriguing stuff. I guess, so I'm a practitioner. We're doing a lot of work at the moment in the corridor in productive spaces from Cambridge all the way down to the Royal Docks. And I'm sort of thinking about how some of this stuff might be applied. I mean, I guess in the back of my mind, we're talking a lot about world-beating things and so on, but we used to be really good at some of this stuff. We used to be very good at the idea of a blended city. The UK's new towns, and we have two in the corridor, were conceived at a previous kind of national crisis, the sort of point of the challenge of the post-war reconstruction, reindustrialization. And they were conceived of as intentionally blended places, designed around sort of mixed urban forms with new industry and education at their heart. And I guess although they've been denigrated, they were really successful. They were very influential. They repaid early government investment in their creation. In the work that we did for the National Infrastructure Commission on the Oxford to Cambridge ARC, we recommended that the Newtown Act, which is still on the statute book, be used to establish better integrated use of land resources in the ARC, and could be a really effective tool, I suppose, for better place making and partnership between government and the private sector. So it now feels, as Greg says, we are hopefully eventually going to emerge from another national crisis, but perhaps this is just a dress rehearsal for a much greater disruption through climate crisis in the future. And I suppose just looking at how government is responding and helping us with that, we have a promised, very much needed revolution in planning promoted through the white paper at the moment. And it sort of feels like a point where we might expect something of the sort of foresight and optimism that Patrick Abercrombie and other post-war planners had, looking at the sort of challenges of the current crisis. But I suppose just thinking about that, what is there in that legislation that will help Greg's notion of the blended city or my ongoing work in the Lee Valley or the ARC? What tools will we have through that? And I must say I have to kind of voice some concerns about that, because it feels to me like that planning talks about the kind of relationship between things and the kind of power differential between very different things, including housing, which is important when you're trying to make a mixed place, when you're talking about hybridity and blend. And yet the white paper is very much about housing and about housing delivery. It feels to me like it's sort of fighting last year's battle in a way, because it's talking about housing rather than industry or workspace or infrastructure, which it's pretty silent on, actually. Secondly, I think the thing that it really ignores is the promise of regional planning, and it removes the duty to cooperate. And this is a real problem when you're talking, as Greg finished there on that slide, of, all our work at the moment is on the boundaries between local authorities. And we saw that with the Olympic site. We're seeing that all the way down the Lee Valley, right across the ARC. The big opportunities are between places. There's very good reasons for that. So we really need government to understand that kind of where the potential for this change and response is going to happen. And it's not at that kind of local authority, local plan level, it seems to me. And then finally, I suppose the ability of local authorities to zone and protect industrial land. For instance, London's already lost 16% of its industrial land over the last 5 years. It can't afford to lose any more. And that this is really important, as Sarah Carey said on this session yesterday, around Enfield, we don't need fewer tools to try and think about this. We need much more nuanced tools to produce more nuanced, place-led quality places that look at the opportunity of co-location, intensification, to bring, as we've learned through the pandemic, our notions of where we live and where we work much closer together, and to make better places. I mean, I'm always absolutely shocked in Cambridge at the poor quality of our working environments and how poorly they support the idea of serendipity. Now, I don't want to go on, so I think maybe I'll stop there, and there's a lot I could say in the questions, but that's probably my 5 minutes.
That's excellent. Thank you, Tom. I think you're right. The planning reforms is certainly something that's very, very relevant to this discussion, and that's something we'll come on to shortly. But first of all, I just wanted to pass over to Monica for her response to Greg, hopefully drawing on her experience of urban planning, I think, around the globe. So, Monica.
Thank you, Helen, and Greg, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and Tom for your remarks. I'll try to share my screen. Can you guys see that? Can someone just tell me if they're able to see my screen?
We can see it, Monica.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I want to speak to some of the points that Greg raised, as well as Tom. And just as a background, I'm a principal city planner at Transport for London, and I'm also on a secondment as senior strategic planner at GLA. And before this, I've been in New York City working as a senior lead urban designer for over 8 years, and also in India as an assistant professor in Center for Urban Science and Engineering. So I'll bring all of those mix of experiences and talk about, as a planner and urban designer, the impacts of COVID. But just to sort of step back and look at, I think the main thing to focus is on people and the quality of life of people, and what do people really want as basic needs, just to go for a run in the morning, or have open spaces nearby, go for work, maybe travel locally or long distances, have their kids go to school, primary, higher education, go to shops, cafes, restaurants, healthcare providers. And one of the important aspects is also make time for leisure and community building. So whether museums, art, or just people watching. So these are some of the basic necessities that people kind of tend towards in their day-to-day life, but there are other things that people really value, is interactions with other people, intellectual stimulation, a sense of community, a sense of place, and a diversity of experiences. So keeping that in mind, how has COVID impacted these aspects of life, and especially the urban areas and the new towns in the innovation corridor? I'll talk about both opportunities and challenges. People are exploring their locality more, and there is an increased sense of community, which Greg also mentioned in his slides. Work from home is an opportunity because it's provide flexibility. There is no stress of getting up in the morning, getting your kids ready, and trying to catch the tube to work. So there is less stress, and there is flexibility around how you want to organize your day. During lockdown, we saw there was improved air quality when the car use was at its minimum, and people were actually able to hear sounds of the birds and really connect with the nature. With using this opportunity of COVID, there is TfL has created a street space for London schemes, where trying to reallocate spaces on the streets for people, because it was very apparent how difficult it was for people to just walk, maintaining the social distance of 2 meters, and having the space on the streets for cars, so there were no places for kids to ride their scooters or things like that. So reallocating that space for people where they can safely walk, cycle, and also for shops to open where you can line up and restaurants to open where you can have seating outside, to sort of bring a sense of normality in life when this is still going on, creating low traffic neighborhoods, which improves the sense of community and allows for increased walking and cycling. We have seen that people are willing to cycle and walk much more than they used to before COVID. And technology has been enabling, still making sure that people can interact and keep those connections. But there are definitely challenges. We have been seeing, at least in London, that it is more of a car-led recovery. People are still afraid to take the public transportation, which is quite understood. There have been studies that the virus is not found in public transportation, but still mentally having that security in mind is still something that we need to address. Work from home, I put it here as well. It is a challenge in terms of the office spaces that are in central areas that are relatively empty, and the economy that depends on those office spaces. There is reduced use of public transportation, which affects the finances of transport for London, as well as the connectivity, and it also leads to more car-led recovery. Unemployment is another challenge, and office area economy. And as Greg mentioned, inequalities have been much more upfront and have been shown by COVID. Now, which changes could likely stay? I think the improved sense of community and people helping each other, that is something that would stay, and people exploring their local areas more, and that could be opportunities for local high streets and town centers. Reallocation of street space, these are temporary schemes, but some of them may become permanent, some of the cycleways, some of the low traffic neighborhoods. I was in our meeting yesterday in Transport for London, and the statistics that I heard, that it took several years to create 50 kilometers of cycle lanes, but only 6 months to create 80 kilometers of cycle lanes. So as Greg pointed out, that COVID has definitely accelerated some of the changes that were already kind of looked forward. There is increased walking and cycling, and people are seeing the health benefits of that, so that should remain. Work from home will definitely increase in terms of as compared to pre-COVID, but this is an opportunity of reduced peak travel demand, at least in London, in the morning and evening peak times, which creates more space for people to travel for leisure activities to longer distances, which is kind of an opportunity for central London to be much more of a cultural and leisure center, and other places that want to create that cultural vibe. For improved air quality, this would need interventions that would reduce the reliance on cars and more towards sustainable modes. So in terms of urban planning interventions, I'm sort of focusing on very general points that we need to think creatively for spaces that are adaptable and flexible and allow for mix of uses, and that would be for office spaces that some of the companies might want to continue work from home. We have seen Google and Facebook in US are actually allowing people to work from home and maybe reducing the amount of office space. So what could be done, and maybe a residential mix of spaces and some experience shopping or things like that, where online retail is much more prevalent now. So how do you kind of create that mix of space where people can still come out in the public realm and interact? Public health should be at the center of planning, and we have to address the inequalities. Otherwise, these kinds of public health crises will exacerbate what we are seeing today. I think sustainable transportation plays a very, very integral role, even though right now the public transport use might be reduced, but this is something that is very critical for the long-term sustainability of urban cities. Then designing places that are more for people and not for cars. So understanding that while we are doing the planning, creatively thinking how to incorporate climate change and enhance globalized cities and bring people of diverse talents, diverse skills, and diverse cultures together. One example, when I heard Greg talking about urban heat, how cities are responsible for urban heat island effect, and that is an opportunity in planning and design to actually bring green infrastructure in the built environment to address that. I think urbanization is the best way to respond to both economic and environmental challenges, and creating these codependent, interdependent corridors is something that is that would be wonderful. I just wanted to also speak a little bit about the planning white paper. Maybe in Q&As there will be more discussion on that. The intention of the white paper is good in terms of creating certainty and engaging community. But as Tom said, it is very housing focused. It forgets about other mix of uses and infrastructure challenges. And I think the timeline is quite aggressive. In New York, the kind of system that they are thinking about, a zone kind of system works well, but it is at a very complex level. And it takes a lot of time and stakeholder engagement to be able to create such a system. So I think there is lack of details, and it needs much more deep thought as if this whole system from discretionary has to change to a rule-based system. And my take on this is that discretionary system allows the flexibility and adaptability to respond to the challenges that will come and are there today. So if it was up to me, I wouldn't get rid of the discretionary system, but there are definitely a lot of positives in terms of digitization of a lot of the elements that can make efficiencies in the system. So those were I think I went over 5 minutes, but thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Monica. I think that was a really useful insight into potential changes in how we sort of live and work and move around. So yeah, if we move on to the sort of Q&A portion of the discussion, and I can see we've got a few questions already, but for any participants who might have a question they want to ask to the panelists, if you do that in the Q&A sort of section, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a button which says Q&A, and you can type your questions into there, and I will do my best to ask them to the panel. One that we've got already from Martina Javara, I think it's on the planning white paper and the reforms, which seems like it's going to be a big part of this discussion. I think what she's saying is, things have obviously changed very rapidly in the past few months, and yet the white paper and the sort of housing formula are based on trends from the past 10 years. So I think she's really asking whether the system can sort of keep up with COVID and all the things that have changed in the past few months. So would anyone like to sort of kick off with some thoughts on that? Perhaps Tom, I know you were talking about the white paper.
Sure. I mean, I suppose I'm quite keen. For some reason in the UK, planning has become a kind of politicized battleground. And I think that's really unfortunate, because in many other countries, it doesn't have that kind of divisive status. I'd much prefer to see what works and what's really evidence-based and is effective. And there's huge amounts of really good practice that we can draw on. We're kind of learning to do well. I'd say the GLA and its partnership with local authority, London boroughs, is a really effective planning agency. And one of the ways to deal with, I mean, government at the moment, we know tends to be a bit obsessed with spreadsheets and Excel. But what we really need to address these kind of big changes and shifts that come out of the pandemic, but will also come out of climate change and the kind of challenges we've got ahead, is very good in advance spatial strategy that is really about having an effective plan that can be modified and changed in response, but is really, I would say that rather than deregulation, we need more creative planning, and that puts us in good stead to deal with, to make us more resilient as a set of places. And there are some great examples of good creative planning. I mean, I would point to the excellent public practice program that really demonstrated that there are creative people out there who would love to get a job in planning and to work with local authorities and re-skill what, as we know, has been a massively degraded profession and, hugely kind of underfunded. And that needs turning round if we're serious about making resilient places that, are really much better and should be much better than they are for us to live and work.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. That's some really good points there. We've had another question. They're really flooding in a minute. We've actually had a couple of questions on the idea of the 15-minute city, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the idea that you can kind of get wherever you're going within a city centre, sort of home to work within 15 minutes. So Charles Crawford Clark is asking what the panel's thoughts are on that and how that might be delivered. Greg, would you like to weigh in on that one?
Well, I think just to firstly say what this idea is, this idea began 30 years ago in the city of Melbourne with their 2030 plan. And then it's been developed in various different ways in continents around the world. And then just recently, in response to COVID-19, Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, sort of announced it as a new thing. Actually, it's an old thing that's being repurposed. But the core idea here, Helen, is not so much that you can get anywhere from the city centre to anywhere else in the city in 15 minutes. That's more a comment really about compact cities and about high capacity public transport systems. It's rather that the city becomes somewhat polycentric in its nature. It has multiple district centres that are able to provide the core amenities and services that people expect within a 15-minute journey from where they live. Now, there's been many experiments, of course, in this kind of decentralized city in the past. And what COVID-19 has done, in a sense, is to make all of that slightly more attractive. Because if you have more choices about where you live, how you work, when you travel and how you travel, it does provide, I think, opportunities for people to want to say, well, we don't necessarily have to work from home, we can work near home. And if you can work near home, then it gives opportunities, in cities like London for suburban centres to densify and to improve their mix, perhaps provides an opportunity to shift from retail, which we know physical retail is in decline, into more amenities, services and other things. And ultimately, perhaps in a second or third wave, it provides opportunity for suburban centres to become centres of employment as well, co-working centres, this kind of thing. So in general, this is a good idea. And if you think about our corridor that we're talking about today, there's all sorts of opportunities for places on the corridor to become, as it were, full service locations, not just servicing, as it were, a residential population, but also being able to serve students and tourists and workers and entrepreneurs and innovators, and gradually diversifying out of being primarily a residential retail mix into a full service location. I think that's one of the exciting aspects of this. And when Anne Hidalgo talks about the 15-minute city and other people say, oh, that sounds interesting, that's great. But I sense, or I smell, as it were, a rat in all of this too, which is that it's very easy to get into the idea that the ideal city is sort of 250,000 people with a single centre, a nice set of housing choices depending upon how far you live from the centre, and a great, transport system that's congestion free and everything else. Of course, the reality is that we start with the existing cities, metropolitan areas and urban forms that we have. And the question is, how do we evolve them in such a way that they become more attractive, more engaging, more livable? Exactly the sorts of things that Tom and Monica were just talking about. So very good idea, but we have to evolve from where we are. That would be my point.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Greg. So that perhaps leads on to some of the questions that we've got in the Q&A about transport. So David Burrows is asking, will places like Harlow benefit? They might not be sort of necessarily suitable for a daily commute into London, but if you're looking at a weekly commute, that might change the situation somewhat. So have any of the panel got any thoughts on, if you're looking at the corridor, what kind of locations might benefit? And maybe that's something that sort of relates to transport as well. I don't know if Monica might like to come in on that.
I think there is more opportunity with the flexibility of work. If you don't have to commute in the center every day, then people have more choices to decide based on their personal circumstances whether they want to move to different places. So definitely I would agree that with this flexibility, there are more choices. But it also sort of brings in, if you do have to commute for more than 2 or 3 days, then the time spent in the commute. So you have to create a balance, and having better transportation choices where you're not stuck in traffic and a direct connection to the place of work would be also beneficial. So transportation becomes an important aspect as well as the choice and flexibility.
And in that case, does that help the case for new investment into infrastructure? So things like Crossrail, for example?
I would think that, yes, as I mentioned in my presentation, that a transport infrastructure is a long-term sustainable investment, even though it might not seem like it right now. But yes, investment in Crossrail and also extending Bakerloo line is something that should happen for the sustainable future of these areas developing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Monica.
Helen, may I add something there?
Yes, please go ahead.
Very quickly, I mean, this is going to be startlingly obvious to everyone who's on the webinar today, but if you think about the corridor that we're discussing, the UK's biggest city, Europe's premier global city, the UK's biggest innovation dynamo, Cambridge, one of the UK's fastest growing cities, Peterborough, two of the UK's best located new towns, Stevenage and Harlow, a whole series of regeneration of former industrial corridors up and down the Lee Valley. What you have in this corridor is a combination of such extremely interesting places that have unusual opportunities to fulfill a new kind of potential because of COVID-19. And if we put to one side, which of course it's hard to do, the health crisis and the recession, this is actually a moment, I think, for this corridor to try to become a kind of demonstration project in the new way of making places and connecting places beyond the pandemic, looking forward to the period over the next 2 to 3 years when, hopefully we have a universally trusted vaccine. We can establish a greater level of participation in public life as a consequence. We can adopt the new practices that make sense, but at the same time, try to enhance them for quality of life. I think that the corridor has an opportunity here to be a demonstration platform for the country as a whole, because of the unique attributes that it has and the combination of places and systems that are here. So we should be thinking about this more as an opportunity to position the various locations on the corridor to, in a sense, demonstrate to others what's possible in this post-COVID environment. And I think that's an interesting way to think about the potential here.
Thank you, Greg. So that sort of got us into quite an interesting discussion about the locations on the corridor. It might be interesting to talk briefly about Cambridge itself. I know it's obviously one of the largest urban centres on the corridor. I don't know if, Tom, you maybe had any thoughts about what Cambridge might look like in the sort of post-COVID world, and what the role for the city might be.
Well, I mean, Cambridge is, in that kind of diversity of places that Greg just set out usefully across the whole corridor. Cambridge has got some really pronounced, I mean, I'm speaking from Cambridge. I've spent most of the pandemic there, and it's been a pretty easy city to kind of weather things out in, but it has some spectacular social challenges. It's the most unequal city in the whole of the UK, and that's been something that's changed over the last 10 to 15 years. It really needs addressing, because it externalizes so many issues socially and economically onto the whole corridor, and makes puts incredible strain on the city and its infrastructures itself. I mean, in terms of infrastructure, the city desperately needs that kind of missing scale of metropolitan scale public transport. It's dogged by congestion, by the fact that there is really no rapid transport system, and yet we need to be much better at being in control of sort of bottom up rapid transport in our cities, taking the lessons that TfL have rolled out so successfully in London. We need to improve our workspaces. As I said earlier, the quality of our working environments, even in Cambridge, with all its wealth, are really terrible. I mean, people in the Science Park or the Business Park here having their lunch, a sandwich from a sandwich van in a car park. This is really terrible stuff. We need to make much better connections between where people work, where they live, and the natural environment around them. So there are plenty of challenges, even in a very prosperous city like Cambridge. In fact, partly because of its prosperity, spatially, that we need to get to grips with.
Okay, excellent. That's some very relevant thoughts there. And actually, something else has just popped into the chat, which relates to that, about housing cost. So how is the sort of cost of housing going to impact on the changes that perhaps need to be made in cities like Cambridge, in the post-COVID world?
We need to build social housing. It's very clear. Everyone connected with housing knows that's the answer. Just get on with it. I mean, luckily, Cambridge City Council are doing that, but we need social housing at scale.
Okay, and I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So perhaps one final point, which I think is something really interesting that's been asked. Obviously, looking at the corridor, there's a huge range of different types of sort of settlements. So I think the relationship between sort of larger towns and cities and more rural areas is going to be really important. Does anyone want to kind of come in with any ideas on how cities and towns and smaller settlements can sort of work together in this sort of future that we're going into? Perhaps one for Greg?
Well, Helen, I think the answer is obvious at one level and then much more complex at another level. The obvious answer is a much greater degree of interdependence and the blurring of the boundaries between urban, rural, semi-rural, semi-urban. The OECD published a big report in June looking at how urbanization was playing out around the world. And what they said is that 1/3 of the world's population now live in cities, 1/3 of the world's population now live in rural areas, and 1/3 live in this rapidly urbanizing intermediate space between the rural and the urban. And as urbanization plays out over the next the next 5 centuries, it will be much more accommodated in smaller cities and towns than in large cities. this is kind of obvious. But what it means is that the effective housing market for all sorts of urban areas in our corridor is now a much larger geography than it was before. The effective housing market now is much more into rural areas. So you'll have rural areas accommodating populations that have urban jobs, but living on rural services. And so all of the issues that Tom raised just a minute ago seem to me to be really pertinent. See, Cambridge's problem, if you like, is that it's a 21st century economy with a kind of 19th century rural infrastructure. And so the challenge then is, how do you shape this new rural urban periphery, which doesn't have the same population density as the cities and towns around which one can organize services, utilities and infrastructure? How do you shape it in such a way that infrastructure and services can be efficient? And that's the much more challenging task for the rural local authorities. They need partnership with the urban authorities on that, but much more that they need, enabling national policies that help to understand how these population shifts will play out and what it means in terms of infrastructure and services.
Excellent, thank you, Greg. Okay, so I can see we've only got a couple of minutes left, sadly, but just before we go, I'd like to just go to each member of the panel for their final thoughts, and I'd perhaps like to ask what you think the biggest opportunity is for the towns in the innovation corridor in the next 5 years. So shall we start with Monica?
Hi, thank you. I think the biggest opportunity is to create places for people to interact and provide a diversity of culture and different mix of people and mix of experiences. So focusing on design and infrastructure is something that's really critical.
Okay, excellent, thank you. On to Tom.
I guess, if one was to ask an ecologist that question, they would say that nature really abhors monocultures. And I think one of the messages coming very strongly out of today is that how we really need to make mixed places. And how we get very good access to nature, how we get better relationships between where we live and where we work and other things in our cities. And that requires lots of creative planning and design, I would say.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. And finally, on to Greg.
Well, I guess I would say, Helen, that London and Cambridge are already world-class global brands and are well known. And as a result, they have very strong demand, but rather constrained supply. And the magic of this corridor is that we have fantastic places like Peterborough, Stevenage, Harlow, and many more, and forgive me for not listing all of them, who are not quite so well known, who are great places, are in processes of reform and improvement, and have the ability to add incredible supply and capacity to the corridor, both in terms of housing, but also in terms of workplaces, innovation locations, science and technology leadership, skills, services, infrastructure, and everything else. And so, if you like, the big opportunity for the corridor is simply to see this as an acceleration of the interdependence I was talking about at the beginning, and to become a full service corridor that's anchored by two world-class locations with great well-known brands, but with another dozen locations that are increasingly providing very high caliber opportunities, housing mixes and options, lifestyle choices that are diverse and are resilient, and because they're interdependent and well organized, they can also become sustainable. So, if you like, this is Silicon Valley, but within the European sustainability framework. So, what's not to like about that?
Excellent, thank you, Greg. Okay, so I think we are just about out of time. Just to say, I think what's been clear from this discussion is that there's a really exciting future for all of the locations on the UK Innovation Corridor. So plenty of food for thought to go away with. All that's left from me is to thank the panel, so Professor Greg Clark, Tom Holbrook and Monica Jane, for sharing their thoughts with us today. Thanks to Anne Lim and the UK Innovation Corridor for facilitating. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. I'm going to hand back over to Ross. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks all the speakers. Really fascinating, very interesting. Glad to see a future, a bright future for the UK Innovation Corridor with so much opportunity. That's it from this session. There's lots more. If you like planning, some of you did, we have a lot of planning, I would expect, in our garden community session, infrastructure for the future, I think it's called, at 2 o'clock. And then more planning in Broken Homes this afternoon at 4 o'clock with Peter Bill and Jackie Sadek. Might even be a bit funny. And if you like the UK Innovation Corridor, which I know you all do, then tomorrow, 2 o'clock, Placemaking for Innovation. I shall see you there, I hope. Thank you to the speakers, thank you to the delegates, thank you to the Innovation Corridor. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.